He took everything. Eleanor Whitmore told her sister the day the judge signed the final decree. But he has no idea what he really carried out of that courtroom. At 63 years old, Eleanor did not cry when the gavel came down in a quiet courthouse just outside Chicago. She stood with her shoulders straight, her gray wool coat buttoned neatly, and listened as the terms of her 35-year marriage were reduced to line items and signatures. Richard Whitmore, 66, walked away with the 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville, the investment accounts that bore his name, and the cherry-red vintage Corvette he polished every Sunday in their driveway. To anyone watching, it looked like a decisive victory for a man who had spent decades introducing himself as the sole provider of the family. Eleanor had once been a certified bookkeeper before their first child was born, but she left her job in 1989 at Richard's suggestion, promising it would be temporary, promising she could always return. Temporary became permanent as 2 children, a mortgage, aging in-laws, and endless school forms filled her days. And somewhere along the way Richard began telling friends at backyard barbecues that he handled the finances, while Eleanor took care of the little things. The little things were property tax payments mailed every August, insurance policies reviewed each winter, college savings contributions adjusted when tuition climbed above $25,000 a year, and medical bills negotiated down with careful phone calls that saved them thousands. The little things were what allowed Richard to feel powerful signing closing documents and shaking hands with brokers. When he filed for divorce just months after their youngest moved to Seattle, he framed it as a practical decision, a fresh start, telling his attorney that Eleanor had never truly contributed income to the household and therefore did not deserve half of what he had built. He said it calmly, almost clinically, as if 35 years could be summarized in a spreadsheet. Eleanor did not argue loudly in court, did not dramatize the nights she stayed up balancing accounts at the kitchen table or the years she drove a 10-year-old sedan so they could accelerate mortgage payments. Instead, she listened, nodded when necessary, and signed where her lawyer gently tapped the paper. Friends whispered that she seemed too quiet, that shock must have numbed her, that no woman her age could possibly rebuild after losing a home valued at over $780,000 and the security of a long marriage. What they did not see was the stillness behind her eyes, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from calculation. Because while Richard focused on square footage, resale value, and the pride of keeping his name on every major asset, Eleanor understood something he had forgotten. Ownership and obligation are twins, and they rarely travel alone. As Richard posed for a photo in front of the house he now claimed outright, already discussing minor renovations and a possible refinance to pull equity, Eleanor folded the final copy of the decree into her leather folder and walked into the crisp March air feeling lighter than she had in years, aware that what looked like surrender was, in fact, the first deliberate step of a plan he had never bothered to read closely enough to see. In the weeks after the decree was finalized, Eleanor Whitmore moved into a modest 2-bedroom condominium overlooking a narrow stretch of the DuPage River, a place less than 900 square feet with beige carpeting and a small balcony just wide enough for a wrought iron table and 2 chairs. And for the first time in decades, every bill that arrived in her mailbox carried only her name. She paid the first month of association dues, the electric deposit, and the property tax installment. Without hesitation, transferring funds from an account Richard had barely glanced at during negotiations because it did not impress him the way a 6-figure brokerage statement did. For 35 years Eleanor had managed the rhythm of their household finances with quiet precision, rising before sunrise to reconcile checking statements, tracking grocery expenses down to the dollar, adjusting automatic contributions to retirement funds whenever interest rates shifted by even half a percentage point. She understood amortization schedules, capital gains taxes, and the long-term impact of carrying high-maintenance assets, and she had tried more than once to explain to Richard that a large house in suburban Illinois did not merely represent success, but also liability in the form of heating costs that could exceed $400 a month in winter, annual property taxes pushing past $12,000, and inevitable repairs that aging roofs and furnaces demanded. Richard dismissed those conversations as worry, confident that appreciation alone justified everything, and when he assumed sole ownership of the Naperville home, He also assumed full responsibility for a property built in the early 1990s with original windows and a roof nearing the end of its rated lifespan. Eleanor remembered the inspection report from years ago, noting that the asphalt shingles might last another 5 to 7 years if properly maintained, and she knew that time was almost up. Meanwhile, she set up her condominium with deliberate simplicity, selling furniture that would not fit the smaller space, declining to replace items that were merely decorative, and redirecting the proceeds into a conservative investment portfolio that prioritized stability over showmanship. She met with a certified financial planner in downtown Chicago to review her individual retirement account and her separate pension benefits, ensuring that required minimum distributions would be timed strategically once she turned 73, and she updated her estate documents to reflect her new circumstances. While neighbors in Naperville admired Richard's decision to keep the house and speculated about renovations that might increase resale value, Eleanor calculated the true cost of repainting, landscaping, insurance adjustments, and the rising association of aging infrastructure that no curb appeal could hide. She did not speak ill of him when their adult children called. She simply asked about their work, their apartments, their travel plans, and she listened. Beneath her calm voice rested the steady awareness that numbers, unlike pride, do not bend to optimism, and she had spent a lifetime learning how to read what numbers quietly predict long before others are willing to see it. By early autumn, the first hairline cracks in Richard's confidence began to show, though he presented them to others as minor inconveniences rather than warning signs. A letter from the county assessor arrived in late September confirming what Eleanor had anticipated months earlier, that the property tax reassessment would raise the annual bill by nearly 15% due to comparable home sales in the area, pushing his obligation to a figure just over $13,800 a year, payable in 2 heavy installments that no longer felt abstract without Eleanor scheduling transfers behind the scenes. At the same time, the furnace that had hummed reliably for more than 2 decades started producing an uneven rattle, and a service technician informed him that replacement would be more cost-effective than repair, estimating a total of $11,000, including labor and updated duct adjustments to meet current efficiency standards. Richard called their son to complain about rising costs in Illinois, framing it as a temporary setback and hinting that the market would soon reward him for holding the property. Yet he avoided mentioning that the homeowner's insurance premium had also increased due to regional storm claims, and that the roof inspection recommended full replacement within 12 months to maintain coverage eligibility. Eleanor learned none of this directly from him. Instead, she inferred the strain from subtle changes in tone during brief conversations about logistics, from the way he asked whether she still had copies of certain warranty documents, and from the single question he posed about whether she remembered the contact information for their former accountant. She provided the information calmly, without commentary, aware that every asset he had insisted on keeping carried an invisible chain of ongoing decisions and expenses. Meanwhile, her own expenses remained predictable. A fixed monthly association fee, a utility bill that rarely exceeded $120 even in winter, and a property tax statement that reflected the modest valuation of her condominium. She spent mornings walking along the river path, afternoons reviewing quarterly statements from her diversified portfolio, noting steady growth that did not rely on prestige but on disciplined allocation across bonds, dividend funds, and a balanced retirement index. When a former neighbor mentioned that Richard was considering a home equity line of credit to cover immediate upgrades before listing the house in the spring, Eleanor felt neither triumph nor bitterness. She simply recognized the familiar pattern of borrowing against tomorrow to preserve the appearance of today. In quiet moments, she recalled how often she had recommended building a larger cash reserve instead of expanding lifestyle expenses, suggestions that had once been dismissed as overly cautious. Now, as heating season approached and contractors scheduled estimates weeks in advance, the true weight of ownership began pressing more firmly on Richard's shoulders, while Eleanor's world, though smaller in square footage, rested on foundations she had measured carefully long before the divorce papers were ever filed. Winter settled over Naperville with a quiet persistence that turned lawns brittle and rooftops silver, and by December the estimates Richard had postponed could no longer be ignored. The roofing contractor confirmed what the earlier inspection had implied. that wind damage and aging shingles required full replacement before another heavy snow season, quoting a total of $28,400 including removal, disposal, updated underlayment, and compliance with current building codes, a figure that lingered in Richard's mind long after the truck pulled away from the driveway. He chose to move forward, reasoning that a new roof would protect resale value, and authorized the work using a combination of savings and a recently approved home equity line of credit that carried a variable interest rate tied to the prime rate, a detail he once would have discussed with Eleanor but now evaluated alone at his kitchen counter. The new furnace installation followed shortly after, adding another monthly payment structure he calculated could be managed once the house sold in spring. Yet the cumulative weight of these decisions began tightening his budget in ways he had not anticipated when he first declared ownership a victory. Utility bills spiked during a particularly cold January when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees for several consecutive nights, and the spacious rooms that once symbolized success now demanded constant heating to prevent pipe damage and uneven drafts. Meanwhile, Eleanor observed the season from her condominium balcony wrapped in a wool shawl, her heating bill steady and predictable, her emergency fund intact. She spent her evenings reviewing her long-term financial projections, adjusting minor allocations to reflect changing bond yields and dividend payouts, and scheduling a consultation with her attorney to finalize beneficiary updates that ensured clarity for her children without exposing them to unnecessary tax burdens. She understood that stability is rarely dramatic. It is built through quiet preparation and respect for compound growth over time. When their daughter called to mention that Richard seemed unusually preoccupied with contractor schedules and financing paperwork, Eleanor responded gently, suggesting that home maintenance often becomes more complex as properties age, careful not to assign blame. She remembered how often she had recommended setting aside a dedicated maintenance reserve equal to at least 1% of the home's value each year, advice once brushed aside as excessive caution. Now, as snow accumulated along the edges of the driveway that Richard alone was responsible for clearing, the symbolism did not escape her. What appears solid from a distance can demand relentless effort up close. By late February, interest rate adjustments increased the monthly obligation on the line of credit slightly above his original projections, and the timing of listing the property grew more urgent. Eleanor, however, measured her days not by urgency, but by intention, aware that the architecture of her future no longer depended on square footage or appearances, but on choices she had made long before anyone realized how carefully she had planned them. By early spring, the house in Naperville was officially on the market, staged with neutral throw pillows and strategically placed lamps to soften the corners of rooms that once held decades of family life. And Richard spoke with cautious optimism about competitive offers even as the real estate agent advised a price adjustment to reflect shifting buyer demand and rising interest rates. The open houses drew steady foot traffic, yet feedback forms frequently mentioned concerns about property taxes, long-term maintenance costs, and the overall size of the home for modern buyers seeking lower overhead. Each week that passed without a firm offer extended the carrying costs, and the home equity line of credit that had seemed like a temporary bridge began accruing interest at a rate that quietly compounded the pressure. Richard calculated potential proceeds assuming a sale close to his original asking price, subtracting agent commissions, transfer taxes, outstanding credit balances, and capital improvements. But the net figure no longer aligned with the confident projections he had once shared. Meanwhile, Eleanor observed the market from a distance, reading quarterly housing reports and noting that comparable homes in the area were selling below initial listings after an average of 30 to 45 days. Her own finances moved along a steadier track. Dividends were reinvested automatically. Her fixed expenses remained predictable, and her credit utilization stood at zero. She spent a mild April afternoon reviewing her retirement timeline, confirming that her pension benefits combined with her individual retirement account distributions would comfortably exceed her monthly needs even under conservative return assumptions. When their son mentioned that his father seemed frustrated by repeated negotiations and buyer inspection requests, Eleanor responded with measured neutrality, explaining that large properties often invite scrutiny because each additional system represents potential cost. She did not need to say more. In late May, An offer finally materialized, but it came in below the revised listing price and included contingencies tied to minor foundations settling noted in an inspection report. After deliberation and further negotiation, Richard accepted, recognizing that prolonging the listing would only extend monthly obligations. Closing documents reflected realities he could not ignore: agent commissions nearing 6% of the sale price, repayment of the home equity line with accumulated interest, prorated property taxes, and credit for agreed repairs. When the final wire transfer settled, the remaining balance was significantly slimmer than he had once envisioned. On the day he handed over the keys, the driveway stood empty, and the echo inside the house lingered longer than expected. Eleanor, sitting at her small dining table overlooking the river, reviewed her own statement that afternoon, noting stable growth and a cash reserve untouched by urgency. What once appeared unequal on paper now revealed a different equation, one shaped not by who held the largest asset, but by who understood its true cost over time. After the closing documents were signed and the proceeds distributed, Richard moved into a high-rise apartment complex closer to downtown Chicago, selecting a two-bedroom unit on the 12th floor with a view of the skyline that he described to friends as a strategic downsizing. Though the monthly rent now exceeded $3,000 and included parking fees he had not paid in decades, the transition required deposits, moving expenses, and the purchase of new furnishings to fit the smaller layout, costs that further narrowed the liquidity he had expected from the sale. Without the house to anchor his identity, his financial picture appeared less expansive and more transactional, shaped by recurring rent rather than long-term equity. Meanwhile, Eleanor's financial planner scheduled a mid-year review, and together they examined the quiet strength of accounts that had remained largely invisible during the divorce negotiations. Her individual retirement account, rolled over carefully years earlier from a part-time position she resumed after the children left for college, and a survivor benefit pension structured to provide guaranteed monthly income indexed modestly for inflation. The projections demonstrated that even under conservative return assumptions of 4 to 5% annually, her portfolio would sustain her lifestyle well beyond average life expectancy tables. She adjusted her withdrawal strategy to remain tax efficient, spacing distributions to avoid pushing herself into a higher bracket and coordinating required minimum distributions with charitable contributions she had long intended to formalize. Richard, in contrast, began exploring part-time consulting opportunities to supplement his income, rationalizing that staying active was beneficial, yet the necessity of additional earnings reflected a gap between expectation and outcome. When their daughter visited Chicago for a conference and met each parent separately for dinner, she noticed subtle differences that she did not articulate. Her father spoke frequently about market fluctuations and apartment amenities, while her mother asked thoughtful questions about her work, her health, and her long-term plans, never mentioning money unless directly asked. Eleanor's evenings settled into a rhythm of reading, light cooking, and occasional walks along the river path, where she considered how many years she had equated security with shared assets rather than personal clarity. She reviewed her updated estate binder one evening, confirming that beneficiaries were clearly designated, healthcare directives notarized, and passwords stored securely, tasks she once handled quietly for the entire household. Now those systems existed solely for her, streamlined and transparent. As summer approached, dividend statements reflected steady accumulation, and the sense of urgency that had once defined the divorce process faded into something steadier: autonomy. Richard's world had narrowed to income versus expense, rent versus remaining proceeds, while Eleanor's had expanded into choice. What had once been interpreted as loss revealed itself gradually as insulation against volatility, constructed not through dramatic gestures, but through decades of disciplined attention that only she had fully understood. By late summer, the differences between Eleanor and Richard were no longer subtle but structural, visible in the way each approached the future. Richard's consulting work filled portions of his week, adding income, but also reminding him that retirement was no longer a fully funded certainty, but a calculation requiring ongoing effort. And the volatility of the market began to influence his mood in ways it never had when Eleanor quietly buffered the household against risk. A brief market downturn trimmed several percentage points from his remaining investments. And though fluctuations are normal in any economic cycle, the absence of a substantial cushion magnified each headline and quarterly report. He found himself checking financial news more frequently, adjusting projections that once assumed uninterrupted growth, and reconsidering travel plans he had mentioned earlier in the year. Eleanor, however, had already structured her allocations with downturns in mind, balancing equities with fixed income instruments designed to temper volatility. And when her portfolio value dipped temporarily, she responded not with alarm, but with review, confirming that her long-term strategy remained intact. She understood that resilience is engineered before it is tested. During a family dinner in early September, hosted at a restaurant near the river, their children observed a quiet contrast. Richard spoke about rising costs in the city and the unpredictability of markets, while Eleanor described a volunteer literacy program she had joined and a short weekend trip she was planning to Door County, budgeting the expenses comfortably within her monthly plan. She did not display extravagance or triumph, only steadiness. Later that evening, as she returned to her condominium and set her keys on the small entry table, she reflected on how often she had once equated security with shared ownership of visible assets, believing that the house, the cars, and the expansive accounts defined stability. What she recognized now was more nuanced. Stability had always come from process, from the discipline of monitoring, adjusting, and preparing for outcomes that others preferred to ignore. Richard had taken possession of structures and statements, but he had underestimated the architecture behind them, the years of incremental decisions that shielded a household from cumulative risk. As autumn approached again and leaves along the river shifted toward amber and gold, Eleanor reviewed her annual spending summary and noted that she had remained well within her projected budget, even after allocating funds for modest travel and charitable contributions. There was no dramatic reversal, no confrontation, only a quiet realignment of reality. The narrative that once framed her as dependent had dissolved under the weight of numbers that now stood clearly in her favor, and the life unfolding before her required no grand gestures, only the continued practice of the foresight she had cultivated long before anyone imagined it would one day define her independence. As the second winter after the divorce approached, Eleanor noticed that time had quietly confirmed what numbers had predicted. Her annual review meeting revealed that despite modest market fluctuations, her diversified accounts had grown steadily, supported by disciplined reinvestment and a withdrawal rate well below the commonly recommended 4% guideline. And her financial planner remarked that her long-term sustainability projections now extended comfortably into her late 80s. Without requiring lifestyle reductions, she listened with calm attention, not surprised, because she had structured her independence around durability rather than display. In contrast, Richard's circumstances continued to narrow in subtle but undeniable ways. The consulting contracts he had relied upon were renewed in shorter increments, and competition within his industry increased as younger professionals offered similar services at lower rates. Rising rental costs in the city prompted his building management to announce a lease adjustment for the coming year, adding several $100s to his monthly obligation. And while the increase was not catastrophic, it underscored the absence of fixed housing security he once believed he had preserved. During a brief phone conversation about coordinating holiday plans with their children, Richard mentioned considering relocating to a smaller unit to reduce expenses, framing it as a lifestyle choice aligned with minimalism. Yet the recalibration carried a tone of necessity rather than preference. Eleanor responded with courtesy and genuine concern, never referencing the past, never drawing comparisons, because the contrast no longer required articulation. One evening in early December, she reviewed a summary of her charitable contributions and confirmed a planned donation to the literacy program she had grown to value, recognizing that generosity felt possible only because her foundation was stable. She updated her beneficiaries once more to reflect small adjustments in account balances, ensuring clarity and simplicity for her children's future, and she reflected on how different this stage of life might have felt had she relied solely on visible assets instead of cultivated strategy. The apartment skyline that Richard once described as invigorating now came with parking fees, utility surcharges, and annual rent escalations that eroded predictability. while Eleanor's modest condominium, though less impressive on paper, represented ownership without leverage and expenses aligned with her means. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reckoning, only the steady unfolding of consequences tied to decisions made months earlier in a courthouse hallway. What had once seemed like loss had matured into insulation. What had once appeared like triumph had transformed into obligation. And as holiday lights reflected softly against the river outside her balcony, Eleanor understood with quiet certainty that security had never been about possessing everything, but about knowing exactly what everything truly costs over time. By the time the third spring arrived after the divorce, the contrast between Eleanor and Richard had settled into something neither of them needed to debate, because reality had already rendered its verdict. Eleanor turned 66 that April, celebrating quietly with her children at a lakeside restaurant where the bill was paid, without calculation or concern, and when she reviewed her annual financial summary the following week, she noted that her net worth had grown steadily despite conservative withdrawals, supported by disciplined investing, controlled expenses, and the absence of debt. Her condominium had appreciated modestly. Her portfolio had recovered fully from prior market dips, and her cash reserves remained sufficient to cover more than 2 years of living expenses without touching long-term assets, a margin that translated not into extravagance, but into calm. She had begun planning a longer summer trip through Wisconsin and northern Michigan, mapping routes and reserving small ends months in advance, confident that her budget allowed room for experience without compromise. Richard, meanwhile, faced a different recalibration. The consulting opportunities that once supplemented his income became less predictable, and a renewal offer arrived at a reduced rate reflecting industry shifts and increased competition. His lease renewal notice included another increase, and after careful review, he decided to relocate to a smaller one-bedroom unit farther from the city center to reduce monthly outflow. The move required another round of deposits and logistics, and although he framed it publicly as simplification, the arithmetic told a clearer story. During a family gathering that summer, their son mentioned long-term retirement planning, and Richard spoke cautiously about timing Social Security benefits to maximize payouts, weighing early filing against delayed credits. Eleanor listened, aware that she had already optimized her own strategy, coordinating pension income, investment withdrawals, and projected benefits with precision that left little exposed to uncertainty. There was no confrontation, no spoken acknowledgement of past assumptions, yet the truth stood plainly between them. Ownership without foresight had proven fragile, while restraint coupled with preparation had proven resilient. One evening in late August, Eleanor sat on her balcony as the sun lowered over the river, reviewing a letter from her financial planner, confirming that her projected lifetime income exceeded her anticipated needs by a comfortable margin. She closed the folder gently, not with triumph, but with understanding. What had once appeared to be surrender had in fact been selection, a deliberate acceptance of assets that carried freedom rather than burden. Richard had walked away believing he possessed everything of value, yet over time he discovered that what he had taken demanded constant payment, constant adjustment, constant vigilance. Eleanor, in contrast, had kept the one asset he underestimated, informed control, and in the quiet rhythm of her days, measured not by status but by stability, she understood that true wealth is not what one claims in a courtroom, but what endures. Long after the paperwork is filed,